Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing support and generosity. We couldn't do this without you. Please stay tuned for just a minute after today's program to find out about our upcoming programs, including a terrific program that we are producing for high school students and teachers in conjunction with the Digital Learning Lab at the University of California at Irvine. For those of you who are familiar with Dan's programs, we will be taking questions in about 30 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. And Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. So we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. It's now my great pleasure to introduce politics professor Dan Schnur and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
You have so many great topics today. The first one, top of everybody's mind, is we haven't had an impeachment in a while. So why the Trump impeachment still matters. Second, what will Biden's big compromise be? And third, Biden's new path on Russia. No more Mr. Nice Guy. We can't wait, Dan. So let me turn this over to you and help you get started. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Kim. And thanks to all of you for joining us here today. As always, we're really grateful for your involvement and your interest and your support. And as Kim said, we have another content-intense week to wade our way through. And so we picked 3 issues, as we always do, to at least frame our discussion and our understanding of what's going on in the world of politics and governance. Yeah, like Kim said, another year, another impeachment. And so this morning, just about an hour ago, the second impeachment of Donald Trump began. We know that he is the first president in our nation's history to be impeached twice. We also know that he's the first former president to be impeached, and that's the subject of today's debate in the Senate. But what's most curious about the trial that started just about an hour ago is how quickly almost everybody involved wants to get it over with. President Biden and the Democratic leaders want this over so they can focus on COVID relief and the new administration's other policy priorities. Republicans want it over so they can stop fighting with each other about whether to be loyal to Trump or not. But there are a lot of Democrats, most notably the 9 House impeachment managers, who argue that Donald Trump violated his oath of office and that he must be held accountable. So even if it's not something that's convenient for the president's agenda, even if it's not something that's preferable for the Republicans trying to decide whether or how to distance themselves from Trump, they are pressing forward. But let's find out what you think. Claire, can we put up our first question and get a sense of our group on whether you think the Senate should proceed with the Trump impeachment trial or not? Option 1, yes, they should go forward because justice must be served. And this is the argument that the impeachment managers are certainly making, as well as some of the Democratic congressional leaders. Second option, yes, they should proceed, but let's do it fast. Let's see if we can get it done in a week or so to get on to other things. Or third, no, the Senate should not proceed because it really is time to move on. Trump is out of office, and let's get on with the business of the nation. So let's see what responses we got on today's. Well, 53%, a little bit more than half of you, believe that the trial ought to proceed. An additional 38% say it should proceed, but pretty quickly. Let's not spend a lot of time on this, and let's see if we can get it done pretty quickly. And only 9% say that no, this trial should not be taking place. It's time to move on. Now, there will be a trial, and that trial is already underway. The opening arguments will go through most of the rest of the week. What's a little bit less clear is what will happen at that point. Just to be more specific, today, 4 hours has been allocated for debate, followed by a vote on whether a former president can be impeached, whether a former president, as opposed to a sitting president, can be impeached, whether that's constitutional or not. Now, not too long ago, when Senator Rand Paul called for a vote on this issue, only 5 Republicans voted against Trump. And that was enough to give the Democrats a majority to move forward. But it's for a conviction, which of course requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate and 17 Republican votes. That doesn't bode particularly well. And it seems at this point very, very unlikely that much will change in terms of those Republican votes. Anyway, so after today, let's assume that the Senate does vote to go ahead with the trial. Then comes 16 hours over the next few days for both sides to present their cases in opening arguments. Then there's 4 hours allocated for question and answer. And it's worth noting that that 4 hours set aside for Q&A is only 1/4 what was allocated during Trump's first impeachment last year. So you can see how much the leaders on both sides really do want to get this behind them. Then toward the end of the week or over the weekend, the Senate will vote on whether to call witnesses into subpoenaed documents or not. And this is a really critical vote because it will tell us how long the trial is going to continue for. If the Senate decides not to call witnesses or subpoena documents, then there are 4 hours for closing arguments, and they pretty much vote and wrap up. But if the Senate does vote to allow the House managers to call witnesses, then we might be at this for a while. What I'd advise you to watch come that critical vote is to think in these terms. The sooner the trial ends, the more influence that shows that Biden had behind the scenes. Publicly, he is very, very studiously staying out of any discussion whatsoever about the impeachment. But it's fairly clear that he and his advisors have quietly been letting the Democratic leadership in Congress know that they want this done and they want it done quick. So if the proceedings were to finish over the weekend or even next Monday, then it's pretty clear that the Democrats in Congress follow the White House preference. If they're still going by the middle or the end of next week, then it's equally clear that they chose to ignore the president's wishes. So the obvious question is, if we know the outcome of the impeachment trial, then why is this important? Well, first, as we alluded to earlier, as most Democrats and many other observers have reminded us throughout, Donald Trump is accused of violating his oath of office. And if, in effect, elected official violates his oath of office, proceeding in this fashion is necessary, they would argue, if only to discourage others from doing something similar in the future. But in addition to the constitutional responsibilities at stake here, the impeachment trial will also tell us something very important about the current state of both the Republican and the Democratic parties. Because even if most Republicans vote against conviction, we're going to learn over the next week or two how wedded the Republican Party still is to Donald Trump and how loyal its leaders still are to the former president. Remember, they're voting today on whether impeachment is constitutional or not. And that's been the GOP's primary reason for not voting against Trump. Not because they disagree, not because they approve of his conduct on January 6th, but because they argue that trying a former president violates the Constitution. So once today's argument is out of the way, and we've settled the question about whether a former president can be tried for impeachment or not, what kind of argument will they make for the rest of the trial? We'll see how closely they stick to Trump, and that's going to tell us a lot about how the party will approach the midterm elections and even the 2024 presidential campaign. There are a lot of Republican senators who will be at these hearings who are thinking about running for president in 2024. And they have a big decision to make, whether to stand with Trump or to stand up to him. Some of those senators, Ted Cruz from Texas and Josh Hawley from Missouri, have made one decision. Ben Sasse from Nebraska, who's emerged as one of Trump's harshest critics, has made the other. But as the trial goes on, let's watch and see how Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton, how Rob Portman and Rick Scott and other Republican senators thinking about a run for the presidency position themselves vis-a-vis Trump. Because if Trump himself decides to run again, They're going to have to take him on at some point. The question is whether they do it now or later. But I think it's worth noting also that we're going to learn something about the Democrats too. Public opinion polls show that even while the large majority of voters strongly disapprove of Trump's behavior on January 6th, only a very bare majority, 52, 53, 54%, want to see him convicted. So what we're seeing in polling is a several point difference between those voters who disapprove of Trump and those who actually want to see him convicted. And this puts the Democrats in an interesting position. Like the Republicans, the Democrats have all sorts of internal conflicts between their ideologically committed base and the party's moderates. We're going to see, depending on how long this trial goes, which of those two voices is louder and more influential in the trial. Because that's going to tell us just as much about the Democrats' frame of mind at the end of the Trump era, as Biden moves forward with his policy goals on which there's a very wide range of opinion within the party. And we're going to talk today and in the weeks ahead about differences of opinion on issues like the minimum wage, on immigration, on climate change, on healthcare. And so we're going to see over the next week or so which wing of the Democratic Party is ascendant and how they might react to the Biden agenda going forward. All right, let's move on to our second topic, and that is Joe Biden gets ready to compromise. Last Tuesday, in our session 1 week ago, we talked at some length about whether President Biden would opt for bipartisanship as it related to the COVID relief bill negotiations, or take more of a party line approach. And then just a few days later, on last Friday, Biden made it very clear he was not going to slow down at all just to try to get Republicans on board. So again, we're going to dig into this topic in much more detail in just a minute. But Claire, maybe we can put our second question to the group now. What do you think? How should Biden approach the Republicans as it relates to COVID legislation? Should, number one, should the final bill have support from both sides, votes from both Democratic and even a small number of Republican senators? Number two, if the final bill includes some Republican ideas, even if no GOP members vote for it, does that count as bipartisanship? Or third, given the urgency of where we are as a country right now, is a party line vote just fine? And let's see what we get from the group. But look at that, only 18% believe that the Biden COVID bill should have votes from both Democratic and Republican congressional members. 38%, a little bit more than a third, say that it should include GOP ideas, even if no Republican members vote for it. So that's interesting. 56%, more than half of our group, believes that Biden needs to make some effort toward bipartisanship, whether it's actually in terms of Republican votes or just mining Republican ideas. And 44%, a pretty hefty plurality, say we can be bipartisan on other things. Right now, a party line vote with just Democratic support is just fine, given the urgency of passing COVID relief. Well, in the last few days, Biden himself has been making some adjustments. Despite his very strong language on Friday about moving forward without Republicans and criticizing Republicans, in his opinion, for being somewhat recalcitrant, it looks like Biden's making some adjustments in the COVID relief bill. And that's not necessarily to get Republicans on board, but rather to secure support from moderate Democrats. Remember that passing legislation, even under the reconciliation process, with a 51 vote majority rather than 60 votes, means that every single Democratic senator has to vote for the bill. And some of the more centrist Democrats in the Senate are beginning to let their concerns be known, most notably Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Now, Biden has promised he will not compromise on the size of the stimulus checks. Those checks are going to be $1,400, and he's not moving from that. And I think that's pretty clear. But there is a question about how targeted those checks should be. In other words, at what income level Americans should stop receiving them, given the presumption that at a certain income level, Americans are no longer in need of stimulus checks. And so there is a fairly heated debate that's arisen within the Democratic Party about how targeted those checks should be. And we're seeing some moderate Democrats joining Republicans to say that the income threshold for relief should be lower. Now, progressive Democrats moved yesterday in the House to include a much larger number of recipients, and there will likely be some compromise there going forward. But there's a big compromise coming from Biden. And the big step back for Biden looks like it will be on his proposed increase in the minimum wage. You may remember that Biden had originally called for a very sizable increase in the minimum wage, up to $15 per hour, as part of this relief package. Now, there's been some debate about whether a minimum wage increase could be included in a reconciliation bill, which requires some budgetary or tax relevance in order for that 51 vote passage to take place. But what we're now seeing is that some moderate Democratic senators, led by Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, are letting it be known that while they'd like to see the minimum wage go up, they don't want to see it go up to $15. And just yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office issued a report saying that while a $15 minimum wage would lift hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty, it would also cause a job loss of 1.4 million jobs. So given all that, what do you think? And Claire, maybe we can put up our next question for the group. On the merits, should a minimum wage increase be part of this COVID relief bill? And we've got a few options here, so I'd ask you to read them carefully. One saying the minimum wage needs to be raised as part of this bill right away. Number two, the minimum wage should be raised, but not in this bill, maybe later. And then third, no, the minimum wage should be left just as it is. So what do you think? Should the minimum wage be raised? And if so, should it be part of this bill? Wow, look at that. Almost 3/4 of you have said that it should be increased, but not in this bill. And along with the relatively small number who do not want to see an increase in the minimum wage, that means that roughly 3/4 of our group believes that the minimum wage increase ought to be left out of this COVID relief bill. Only 23% should say it should be included. Well, it looks like Joe Biden is coming to agree with our 3/4 majority here, because Biden does seem to have decided that it's going to be better to wait on this. He may push for a minimum wage hike later this year, but right now the president looks like he's decided it's just not worth the fight to include it in the COVID legislation. Now, that's going to be a big disappointment to Bernie Sanders and to other progressives. And that's one of the reasons they'll be fighting so hard to make sure the stimulus checks go to as many recipients as possible. But first big compromise from Biden, even without bipartisan votes for his package, means that the minimum wage is at least a temporary casualty of the legislative process. So third and finally, let's go on to Russia. No more Mr. Nice Guy. How Joe Biden intends to deal with Vladimir Putin. So think of it this way. Joe Biden is the first president in the post-Soviet era, the first American president since the Berlin Wall came down, who came into office not promising better relations with Russia. We've heard this from presidents of both parties since the end of the Cold War. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, Democrats, George W. Bush, and of course, Donald Trump, Republicans. Not Biden. Biden has already made it clear that he's laying the groundwork for potential very punitive actions toward Russia, even at the outset of his administration. And that's unique among his recent predecessors, every single one of whom attempted, at least, to turn a new page with the Kremlin in hopes of encouraging a more productive relationship. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the matter. Is Biden taking the right approach here? Is being more confrontational the way to go? Claire, can we put up the question? So what do you think? How should Biden approach his relationship with Russia? Should he be more confrontational and put more pressure on Putin and the Russian leadership to change their behavior than Trump did? Or less confrontation and pressure? Should he make more of an effort for common ground? Or third, of course, no change, to continue on the pathway that Trump started on over his 4 years in office. What do we got? 82% agree with the no more Mr. Nice Guy approach. 82% say more confrontation and pressure on Putin and Russia is what's called for. 14% say less and to make more of an effort for the common ground. And only 4% say to stay as is. So let's talk a little bit about what that means, a more confrontational relationship, more pressure from Biden toward Putin. So in Biden's first days as president, he had a phone call with Vladimir Putin. And in a 5-minute phone call, Biden effectively reset US relationships, all in one phone call of just a few minutes long. In 5 minutes, Biden called out Putin for the arrest of opposition figure Alexei Navalny and called Putin out as well for the crackdown on Navalny supporters. Second, Biden raised charges that Russian security services were behind the recent massive cybersecurity breach that US government and so many private sector entities have suffered. And third, he pressed allegations that Russia had offered the Taliban bounties to kill American troops in Afghanistan. Now, none of these issues are new. We've read about all of them over the last weeks and months. But the fact that a newly elected American president chooses to put all of those things in Putin's lap in that introductory or in that initial 5-minute phone call is very telling. Now, it's reasonable to expect that Biden is going to keep up the pressure going forward because the president has recruited a team of very pronounced Putin skeptics for his administration, including Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And Blinken, in his confirmation hearings just a week or so ago, was talking about Putin's reaction to the Navalny protests. And Blinken said something really interesting, and I'm quoting from him. He said, quote, "It's extraordinary how frightened Vladimir Putin seems to be of one man," unquote. It's extraordinary how frightened Vladimir Putin seems to be of one man, says the US Secretary of State. Not just criticizing Putin on a political decision, but offering a pretty pronounced personal dig as well, which I think is very, very telling on how this administration is going to confront Putin. Now, along with Blinken, of course, we have National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who's also considered to be a Russia hardliner. But the most interesting appointment on this front from Biden was his Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland. And Nuland in particular is just reviled by Putin and his aides and has been for years for her support of pro-Western politicians in the Ukraine. And she held the Europe portfolio at the State Department in President Obama's second term, in which she was very, very aggressive in her dealings with the Russians. Nuland and Sullivan are said to share opinions about how to deal with Moscow. Both believe in taking a very tough line on human rights and on Russia's intentions in Eastern and Central Europe, while even still keeping an open channel to the Kremlin on other matters, such as arms reduction. So make no mistake about it, things are about to get much more tense between the United States and Russia, which is just what President Biden wants. Two other quick things about Russia, and then we'll be getting to your questions. Number one, those Navalny protests are causing Putin all sorts of problems at home. Putin's poll numbers are down, they're at historic lows, but very tellingly, he's suffered an even greater drop-off among young Russians. Russian Gen Z and millennial voters in their 20s and 30s have soured on Putin, particularly over the Navalny controversy. And these protests have spread from Moscow and other major urban areas to small towns and rural communities across all 11 of Russia's time zones. And this is creating a real domestic challenge for Putin. Now, on the other hand, the potential wild card in all this is the great success that Russia has had with its own COVID vaccine. Now, we should know that they were taking it seriously when the Russian leadership named their vaccine project Sputnik, to recall what they consider to be one of their nation's greatest successes in recent history. And that made it clear, just the naming of the project, that they were taking this very, very seriously. But the Sputnik vaccine has been extremely successful to the point where Putin is exporting enormous amounts of the vaccine to Africa, to Latin America, and to Asia, all with an eye toward long-term relationship building. Now, key U.S. allies like Mexico, like India, like Brazil, like United Arab Emirates are all signing up for the Sputnik vaccine too. And the problems that the European Union is having with their own distribution is creating an immense opportunity for Russia to improve its relationships with many European countries. And even longtime Putin skeptics like Angela Merkel in Germany are sounding particularly receptive to coming to an agreement for the vaccine. And European countries that have been pressuring Putin on the Navalny situation could end up in a very tight squeeze and be forced to back down from their criticism of Putin in order to get the vaccine for their citizens. Now, as we've discussed before, China is using their vaccines for the same type of geopolitical outreach, which means not only does the United States have to reestablish its international credibility on diplomatic, economic, and security matters in fairly short order, but the Biden administration is facing a potentially large disadvantage and particularly immense challenge on vaccine-related soft power concerns from our two greatest geopolitical rivals. So lots more to talk about, lots more to think about. And of course, we'll introduce new topics in next week's conversation. But we're just getting up on the bottom of the hour now. So if Jessica's willing to join me, we can shift to my favorite part of each week's programs, in which we begin hearing questions and comments from all of you. So Jessica, what do we got from our group?
Thank you so much, and welcome back, everybody. Welcome to Tuesdays with Dan, not Thursdays with Dan. I'm sure it's confused everybody on what day it is now. I keep thinking today is Thursday if it's Dan Day, so still getting used to that. Our first question, can the Democrats reach a consensus on COVID relief, including direct payments and minimum wage issues that both Joe Manchin and Bernie Sanders can vote for?
Well, it's a great question, and it goes back to the compromise we were talking about earlier, because whether it's on minimum wage, whether it's on the income threshold for stimulus checks, Biden and his team are very aware that they cannot afford to spare a single Democratic vote in the Senate in order to get this through, and only a handful of votes in the House of Representatives. So the short answer is they'll have to, because as different as Sanders and Manchin, as different as the progressive base of the Democratic Party and its center is as much as important as those differences are to both sides. Neither one can afford to see a Democratic president start out with a notable legislative failure, particularly on an issue of such critical import to their voters. So it's hard to see right now what that compromise looks like. Like I said, it looks like the minimum wage is going to have to wait. There will be negotiations over the relief checks. And my guess is what we'll end up with is that while most Americans receive a $1,400 check, we'll end up seeing gradually decreasing levels of stimulus checks for Americans of somewhat higher income levels. So we don't know what the compromise is going to look like, but we know that whether progressive or centrist, the Democrats in Congress know that they can't let Joe Biden come up short on this. So there will be a compromise that picks up their votes, but it's probably going to be a couple of weeks before we know what it is.
Thank you. This questioner says, why should relief payments be made to those who have been able to maintain their job? And somebody else also asked if Americans living abroad will also get the $1,400.
So any American citizen who pays taxes will get the $1,400. Although I should say, and we'll talk much more about this next week when we dig into the immigration issue, that there's already an emerging split in the Democratic Party about whether undocumented immigrants should receive that stimulus check or not. And several Democratic senators, including Debbie Stabenow, who's number 4 in the Democratic leadership in the Senate, and Gary Peters, her fellow senator from Michigan, who's the head of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, voted with Republicans this week to prohibit undocumented immigrants from receiving these direct stimulus checks. The question about whether people of higher income should receive the checks or not is exactly the argument that Manchin and other centrist Democrats are making. Manchin believes that anyone who makes over $50,000 a year or $100,000 for a couple is doing well enough, maybe not completely economically secure, but well enough that it's not a good use of funds to provide them with a stimulus check. Bernie Sanders came out and argued this week, saying these are voters who Donald Trump provided economic support to. How can we as Democrats not? So as you move up the income level, it's important to remember that we're not talking about millionaires receiving these checks. But the question is whether a couple with a six-figure income or a couple with children with an income of even a higher level should still receive the checks or not is a fundamental disagreement between the two wings of the Democratic Party. And like I said, my guess is we see a compromise in which, as you go into the upper echelons of those thresholds, those wage earners who make between $50,000 and $75,000 a year, they'll get a stimulus check, but probably not quite as much as those at the lower end of the income strata.
Is Biden negotiating against himself by making changes to the COVID relief bill without getting bipartisan support?
Well, I think Biden decided last week, as we talked about, that he was not willing to slow down in order to compromise with Republicans. And that's a decision he made, both given the timing and the urgency of passing the bill, but also for the reasons that the questioner references, which is if you concede too early in these negotiations, the other side just simply asks for more. But as I said earlier, even while Biden made it clear that he was happy to talk with Republicans, but not to slow down for them, while he doesn't have to slow down for Republicans, he does have to slow down for moderate Democrats. And it's not just Manchin. Senators Sinema and Kelly from Arizona, Senator Tester from Montana, and others all have reservations about different aspects of the bill. So to me, it's not necessarily a matter of Biden negotiating himself at this point, but rather bowing to reality that if he wants to get 51 votes for a bill in the Senate, he is going to need even the most centrist members and is going to have to appeal to the most moderate members of the House as well. Negotiating himself against himself implies making those compromises before entering into external negotiations. It's pretty clear that Manchin and Sinema and Tester and others have been talking to the White House pretty regularly and letting it know what they can abide and what they can't when it comes to a final COVID bill.
The Treasury Department released its final monthly Treasury statement for fiscal year 2020, showing a record $3.1 trillion deficit for this year and debt held by the public at over $21 trillion. Could you explain what this actually means and how this money will be replaced?
Well, this is one of the biggest, most important, and most underreported changes in American politics that's occurred over the last few years. And that is the debate over deficits and the federal debt. For many, many years, an argument has raged about whether the federal government should be running deficits and at what level. The argument against it being that if we run up debt now, ultimately it will be our children and our grandchildren who have to pay that. And there's no question that an increasing percentage of the federal budget is now spent on debt relief or on debt payments, which means it's not available for healthcare, for infrastructure, for tax relief, and for other types of programs that most elected officials would prefer to support. But there is an emerging school of thought in both parties that because interest rates are so low, that running a deficit is not nearly as damaging in the long term as it would be under more conventional circumstances. In other words, if I borrow money from my bank, whether it's for a home mortgage or borrow money to buy a car or to send my children to college, if I can borrow that money at very, very low interest rates, then it's very enticing to borrow more money because I can pay it back without as much of a financial burden. Well, that's the situation in which the United States finds itself right now. Because these interest rates are lower, the country can borrow money at a more forgiving rate. It doesn't put as much of a burden on future generations. Certainly, there's no question that Republicans tend to talk a much tougher game on deficit reduction under Democratic presidents than under Republicans, and that's another conversation for another day. But to me, what's more interesting and more unusual is the idea that more and more economic minds in both parties are saying that deficit spending can be tolerated not just in times of great duress, during times of war, during times of economic setback, but even during more conventional time periods, given where interest rates lie right now. So you do hear voices, primarily from Republicans right now, warning about the size of the deficit, but those voices are fewer in number and not quite as loud in volume as they have in the past, given the changing nature of this debate. It'll be very interesting to watch going forward that once our country has made it out of a COVID emergency, whether those arguments about deficit spending sustain in this way.
Thank you. Another economic question. I was disappointed that Biden reinstated tariffs on United Arab Emirates aluminum, despite it being off the political radar screen, and there are many more workers in aluminum using industries than in aluminum producers. Along with the changes in Buy American policies for the federal government, does this indicate an active protectionist economic policy?
It certainly does. And we've talked about this for much of the last several months, that while Biden tends to engage internationally in all sorts of ways that Trump has preferred not to, that when it comes to trade, that it appears that both parties are reverting to much more of a protectionist model. It's worth remembering that in 2016, it wasn't just Donald Trump who opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have finalized an increased trade with 14 Pacific Rim countries. It wasn't just Donald Trump who opposed it, Hillary Clinton did too. And in this last campaign, we heard both Donald Trump and Joe Biden making all sorts of economic nationalism type noises about cutting back on trade opportunities. And while the questioner is right that this particular deal with the United Arab Emirates does not receive a great deal of attention, it's indicative of an administration that is going to be much more wary on trade, international trade agreements, than either the Obama or the Clinton White Houses were during those two presidencies. So I suspect, as we talked about last week on a geopolitical international sense, there was a European diplomat who said the United States has a new president, but it's not a new country. Is that there are very, very strong protectionist and economic nationalist sentiments in this country across the political spectrum. And just like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden is responding to them in a much more notable way than George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama ever did.
If a former president, Trump, can be impeached after being out of office, what would prevent a future Republican Congress from impeaching, say, Obama for violating his oath of office over some issue? How far could they go back? Martin Van Buren?
Well, this is the argument against impeaching a former president, which is once you open it up for one side, then why can't the other side do it in return the next time that they hold congressional majorities? And theoretically, the answer is that there's no reason that they couldn't. Now, the Democratic House managers and the Democratic House impeachment managers and the other strongest supporters of impeachment argue that this is something far and apart from the type of policy disagreement that we're talking about. Their argument is that when the head of one branch of government attempts to incite violence against another branch of government, that isn't simply a policy disagreement, that is an abject violation of the Constitution. And we can agree, regardless of whether you think Trump should be convicted or not, that is of different scale in scope. But the questioner is exactly right, that there has been no constitutional precedent for impeaching a former president. So there's no reason that both parties couldn't do it on a much more regular basis. Ironically, it's the same argument, though, that Democrats made back in the late 1990s when Bill Clinton was impeached. So the slippery slope argument works in both directions. But while I think there is a matter of difference in terms of potential impact of the accusations Trump is facing, the questioner makes a valid point. There is nothing, at least constitutionally, to prevent both parties from impeaching former presidents if they were to choose to do so. The one thing that might hold them up is the court of public opinion. And as we all know, on matters like these, that can be pretty volatile.
We had a couple people asking this question. Is there any reason why a vote has to be seen by the public, or could the vote to convict Trump be secret?
So constitutionally, there's no reason that the vote to convict Trump couldn't be secret. And as you may have noted last week, when the House of Representatives voted to support Representative Liz Cheney to remain in her leadership position even after voting to impeach Trump, a secret ballot demonstrated that there's a lot of members of the House of Representatives, at least, a lot of Republican members of the House, who might not want to call out Trump publicly, but on a secret ballot, very much want to move on from him. And they demonstrated that in their support for Cheney. So constitutionally, there's nothing to prevent that vote from taking place on a secret ballot rather than on a public one. But the leaders of both parties, it appears, have largely rejected that approach, because they say that even though there's no constitutional prohibition to a secret ballot, that the extraordinary step of convicting a president or a former president is something that a duly elected official ought to be willing to stand for publicly. So that's not a constitutional barrier, but rather, I guess you could call it a political one. You could also call it a point of honor. But in either case, both Democratic and Republican leaders agree that it is the obligation of an elected official to vote in public on such a seminal matter.
Thank you. And one other question we got a few times. Is there another way to assure that Trump cannot run again for president other than impeachment?
Okay. There is. And the longer conversations we've had in the past and can have again in the future once the impeachment is passed. But there's a provision of the 14th Amendment, which, if employed, could prohibit Trump from running in the future. It was originally enacted as a way of preventing former Confederate soldiers and office holders from running for office in the United States. And there's some debate among constitutional scholars about whether it could be applied in Donald Trump's case or not. But it's at least plausible to assume that if the Democrats chose to do so, that they could at least explore whether an application of the 14th Amendment could prohibit Trump from running again. But I have to say there's probably a lot more Republican presidential aspirants who would like to see that happen than Democrats. But let's make that a longer and deservedly longer conversation for another day once the impeachment has concluded.
This is about Biden's administration, but a bit off topic. Why hasn't Merrick Garland's confirmation hearing happened yet?
Well, several of Biden's cabinet nominees have not yet been confirmed. And for the most part, it's just because there's a logjam in the Senate. Number one, because it took until the first week of January to find out which party was going to be in control of the Senate. And then after that, it took a few weeks for the two parties to negotiate out a power sharing arrangement between a Senate that was split 50-50. They got a very late start on confirming Biden's nominees. At this point, it looks like Republicans might look to slow down a couple of them, most notably Javier Becerra, California's current Attorney General, who's Biden's nominee for Health and Human Services, and Neera Tanden, who's the president's nominee to serve as director of the Office of Management and Budget. But at this point, it doesn't appear that there's anything that's going to prevent Garland from taking office, except that, as you might guess, the committee that would first examine his nomination, the Judiciary Committee, is a little bit busy this week with impeachment. So I suspect they'll turn to a new Attorney General as soon as this is out of the way. One of the many reasons that Biden would prefer to see the impeachment trial over sooner rather than later.
This questioner says, changing topics. One, what will Vice President Harris's main focus be during the next 4 years? And two, which will be the first foreign country President Biden visits and why?
There's been a lot of speculation about Harris's role as vice president. And it appears that Joe Biden sees Kamala Harris's role as being very similar to Joe Biden's when he served as Barack Obama's vice president. So unlike VPs in the past, who've been given a particular area of policy on which to focus. Biden was not designated in a particular area, but was rather part of Obama's decision-making process almost across the board on most important matters of public policy. So rather than specializing or pigeonholing a vice president in one direction, Biden, from his own experience in that role, does not appear to want to give Harris a particular task that's her primary focus, but rather to keep her engaged on a broader and wider set of policy matters. It does look like she will play an unusually high-profile role as a salesperson on behalf of the administration's agenda. Biden, because of COVID and other reasons, is probably not going to be as high profile, certainly not as high profile as Trump, but probably not even as high profile as other 21st century presidents. And it looks like Harris will be playing a much more visible role in the public arguments on behalf of the administration's policy priorities. Where will Biden's first foreign trip be? My guess, and it's just a guess, I haven't seen any speculation based on very much yet. I would be surprised if it was somewhere other than Canada or Mexico. I suspect, number one, given COVID travel restrictions, and number two, given the importance of those two relationships, it's easy to see that Biden would start with those two countries. That said, there is a European summit scheduled for this June or July, late spring or early summer in Europe. And there's already some talk about Biden going to that. If he hasn't traveled abroad by then, that could be his first foreign trip, because it would demonstrate on an international stage his commitment to multilateralism and his interest in working with many countries as a whole. So it's pretty likely that he will attend that summit when the time comes. The question is whether he travels abroad between now and then. And if he does, I suspect it's probably closer to the US borders rather than further.
What could be some of the possible negative consequences of Biden's aggressive approach towards dealing with Russia? What types of reaction is Putin likely to counter Biden's aggressive approach towards dealing with the Kremlin?
Well, Russia has maintained a fairly strong economic relationship with many European countries. And that's something he intends to continue. And it puts a lot of European countries in a fairly awkward position, because while on one hand, on human rights issues and other geopolitical issues, they are very suspicious of Russia. They are somewhat reliant on those economic relationships, particularly as it relates to energy. So number one, he could put our European allies in a more difficult situation. And it's worth remembering that these European allies, even though they recognize that Biden's approach to Europe is much different than Trump's, they're feeling a little bit burned right now. And they're not all that eager to rush back into the arms of the United States just because there's a new president. So given the impact of the last 4 years on the relationship between the US and our traditional European allies, there's an opportunity there for Putin and Russia using economic leverage to establish a much greater foothold there. And then more broadly, in Africa, in Latin America, in places in Asia, both Russia and China understand the benefits of a very far-flung set of allies in relationships. I mentioned earlier they intend to use their COVID vaccines to do so, but both countries have already been very active internationally. And the more countries, whether in the UN or elsewhere, that line up with China or Russia, the more difficult it becomes for the US and its allies to call out bad behavior from either country. So the question is a smart one, because compared to Russia, compared to China, compared to the United States, Russia's economy is fairly small, and its ability to have a global impact is much less. But Putin can cause all sorts of problems for the United States in Europe, in the Middle East, and elsewhere, should he so choose. And so Biden pushing back harder could make it more difficult to negotiate with Russia in those other areas. One thing that, I apologize if I'm rambling, but it came to mind as I was answering the very smart question, is one place where a more where a more prickly relationship between Putin and Biden could cause some challenges is in Iran. Biden has made it very clear that he wants to re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement. There's all sorts of political cross pressures in the Middle East that might make that harder. Having Russia as an invested ally as opposed to as an equally invested antagonist could make a very challenging situation in the Middle East for Biden even more challenging should Putin choose to do so.
Another question on Russia. Do Putin's actions only reflect his and like-minded Russians' unhappiness about the fall of the USSR and perceptions about international role of Russia, and perceptions about the international role Russia should play as opposed to focusing on long-term needs of Russia in light of its very unfavorable demographics? What are the thoughts of Tony Blinken and others regarding what long-term US objectives should be regarding US-Russia relations? Sorry.
Well, Biden and Blinken and others have made it clear they'd like to see a collegial relationship between the two countries, but only when Russia has begun to abide by international norms on security, on human rights, and on other measures. But the first part of the question is a really fascinating one, and it's less political than it is cultural, which is how do Russians see their role in the world, particularly vis-a-vis the fall of the Soviet Union. There's been quite a bit written about Putin's own thinking on this, and he believes he's motivated, and I don't think the word I'm going to choose is too strong, is motivated almost by revenge as to what he sees as ongoing Western aggression toward the Soviet Union that ultimately caused its fall. And he wants payback. That's a very large motivator for Putin himself. But more broadly to the question, I think that societal attitude is something that is reflected in a real generational split in Russia. In other words, for Putin and his generation, the fall of that Soviet Union is never that far outside their minds, and it really is a motivator, not just for Putin himself and not only for his closest allies, but for those who experienced that very turbulent time in history. But I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the Navalny protests, is that Putin's public opinion ratings have taken a disproportionate hit among younger Russians. And Gen Z and millennials who weren't around or weren't aware when the Berlin Wall came down are less invested in that time in history and are more interested in exploring economic opportunities, being given human rights and other freedoms that haven't been in evidence in Putin's Russia. So I think as the number of voters who experienced the Cold War continues to shrink, and the percentage of the Russian people who came of age after the fall of the Soviet Union continues to grow, I think Putin's mindset isn't going to disappear, but it's going to become less widely shared. And I don't pretend to know how quickly that change will take place, but it appears that the Navalny protests are accelerating that attitudinal shift.
On the topic of vaccine diplomacy, we have two questions here. With China's huge population, how can they produce enough vaccine to export to third world countries? And then somebody else asked, is either of the US COVID vaccines available to other countries?
So I'll answer the questions in reverse order. The US has committed some, and I underscore the word some, of its own vaccine capacity to other countries, but working through the World Health Organization and other multinational entities, while the US is committed to providing vaccines to countries around the world. The urgency with vaccinating the residents of this country and the competition for the vaccines that we're already seeing is limiting how much the US is going to be able to do and be willing to do in the short term to help other countries with their own challenges. The advantage that China has, of course, on this is it's an autocracy. And if President Xi and the other Chinese leaders decide that it's to their nation's benefit to lead some of their own citizens without vaccines in order to realize geopolitical goals in other parts of the world, that's a decision that's much easier for their government to make than ours. There's also a matter of scale, at least so far. The industrial capacity for China to produce these vaccines at a much greater level gives them an advantage in this sort of international vaccine competition with the United States. Biden has made it very clear he intends to catch up, but he started from a pretty significant disadvantage, and it's going to take a while before the US has the capacity to play the same type of role internationally as it relates to vaccine distribution and availability that China is playing and that Russia looks like it's preparing to play.
Thank you. What kind of recession is really happening when real estate and Wall Street are setting all-time records?
Well, we've talked about this before. It's what they call a K-shaped recession. And for those Americans who can work from home, who can work by computer and by phone, there hasn't been really much of a recession at all. We faced a lot of inconveniences in terms of how we live our lives, but economically we've not been impacted. And it's one of the reasons that California and so many other state level budgets haven't taken harder hits, because higher income taxpayers are doing just fine. But the real economic hit is on lower income workers and on unemployed, non-essential workers. And so while on one hand, real estate values in the stock market and other measurements of overall economic growth look just fine, the disparity between higher income earners and those struggling to make it are growing and growing. That plays into the minimum wage debate that we discussed earlier, how raising the minimum wage would alleviate poverty for some, but cost jobs for others. It plays into the discussion of the thresholds for the stimulus checks that Manchin and Sanders are now arguing about. But one of the things that we'll have to do as a society going forward is recognize not that the types of measurements that the questioner asked about, real estate and the stock market and so on, not to suggest that those aren't valid economic measuring tools, but we have to figure out a way to talk about the country's economic situation as it relates not just to those at the upper end of the income strata, but those on the lower end as well.
This questioner says, why did retirees receive a stimulus check? They did not lose income.
Yeah. Well, retirees received a stimulus check primarily because while the stimulus is designed to make people whole from lost income, it was also designed to encourage spending, to keep the economy from slipping deeper into recession. So if a retiree gets a check, he or she is more likely to patronize a business, more likely, if not to go to a restaurant, to order food, and to have an economic impact. So the checks are designed, number one, to make people whole who've been hurt by a COVID-driven recession, but also to put money into the pockets of consumers to encourage spending. One of the primary arguments against providing stimulus checks to higher income earners is there's evidence that those who are in less immediate and urgent need of stimulus funds tend to save that money rather than spending it. And then an argument could be made to the same degree with some seniors, but particularly for middle or lower income seniors, the idea was to give them the ability to spend to help forestall against greater economic downturn.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. I know we're at the end of the hour, so you covered a lot of topics today and we still had a lot more questions. So thank you again. And Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thanks, Jessica.
Jessica, thank you. She does a great job with all those questions coming in. You're so popular with the questions. Thank you so much for your calm guiding hand through all these important discussions, Dan. I think I can speak for all of our audience that we can't wait for Tuesdays now just to see how you're going to guide us through these important discussions. So thank you so much. For our audience, as you know, these live streams are being offered as free as a public service, but you may not know that your generosity in providing donations also supports our live stream outreach to the public high school students. Our next high school program on the Digital Learning Lab at the University of California at Irvine will be this Friday. If you'd like more information about that, please reach out to our membership manager, Christina Shabanava, and she can help you with more information. I have an update on our Bill Gates program on February 19th. He will be joined in conversation with climate change activist, philanthropist, and award-winning actor Don Cheadle. And tomorrow we have a group of medical experts from Cedars-Sinai who are going to be giving us all the information we need to know about the COVID mutations, what's the difference between a mutation and a variant, and how does that impact the whole vaccine process. And of course, we have politics in the time of coronavirus next Tuesday with Dan. And as most of you know, for our members, we enable a small group to talk with Dan immediately following his program every other week. So if you want to engage with Dan directly, please become a member and sign up. Go to our website at lawacth.org, sign up for upcoming programs, become a member, make a donation. Dan, thank you so much for everything you do. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.